Captain Aaron Hale had flown the Pacific Eagle, a twin-engine turboprop commuter plane, along the mountain corridor for years. The route between Crestview and Larkspur was usually straightforward: up over the ridgeline, descent through the valley, and a gentle glide into Larkspur's regional airfield. That afternoon, however, the weather models had begun to murmur of a developing convective cell pushing out of the coastal plain. By the time Pacific Eagle's Flight 317 climbed to cruise altitude, the cell had ballooned into a fast-moving, localized storm system, a narrow but ferocious line of convective turbulence, wind shear, and torrential rain that, according to the latest satellite uplink, would cut directly across their planned descent corridor. Aaron's co-pilot, Mei Lin, ran her fingers across the weather radar display. "We've got a line of cells building faster than expected," she said, voice low but steady. "The valley's going to fill with shear. Larkspur Tower's gone to minimums. They're reporting reduced visibility below 800 feet and outages in the outer glide slope." The automated readouts confirmed their concern. One of the aircraft's hydraulic pressure sensors had begun to flicker erratically, the kind of early-stage glitch that could preface a more serious failure if the system was stressed too hard in turbulence. "Let's hold high," Aaron replied. "I don't want to be dropping into that without a plan. Let ATC know we're delaying descent. Possible diversion if the storm doesn't break." They vied with the rising gray wall ahead, watching their ground speed fluctuate as gusts tussled the ship. The mountains, usually clear markers, began to hide in mist. Larkspur's outer beacon blinked a warning of deteriorating ceiling. Below them, the valley held a thin strip of silver, an old private airstrip named Willow Creek, engraved into maps decades ago, and since used only sporadically by agricultural surveyors and emergency medevac crews when conditions permitted. Willow Creek lay in a shallow basin, surrounded by the ragged fingers of oak and mesquite, with a runway of compacted dirt that became treacherous when wet. Its existence was known to Aaron, a former bush pilot, but it had never featured on a regular passenger flight plan. As the storm line nosed toward the valley, the idea of using it as an alternate had not yet formed. Safety briefings prioritized official fields and formal alternates. At 13,000 feet, the storm's outer cells flashed with electrical activity, and their descent path was now bracketed by turbulence echoes on radar, green to yellow to angry reds, marching like a tide. Somewhere below that chaos, in a small stand of oaks, not far from Willow Creek, a tiny hummingbird stirred from its daily mid-afternoon feeding routine, sensing the change in air pressure and the growing scent of ozone. The bird had nested there for 2 seasons, bright throat catching the little shafts of light that pierced the cloud underbelly, and had learned to read wind shifts the way a sailor reads waves. What it didn't know was that its jittery, frenetic flight would soon intersect with steel and desperation. As Flight 317 began its initial descent, the first of the storm's edge hit. It came as a wall of rain, heavy vertical sheets that blurred terrain and flushed sunlight into greenish gloom. The autopilot began to fight the gusts, and Aaron disengaged it manually, feeling the subtle pitch changes through the yoke. Mei Lin called up the status. "Hydraulic pressure dips again on System 2. It's stabilizing, but we're getting spikes in the pump load. Crosswind component is building to 60 knots gusting." This isn't what the briefing said. "Get me Larkspur on frequency," Aaron said. "We're going to need a weather update and a go, no-go on approach." Tower replied with static-laced voice. "Eagle 317, visibility at field is down to 600 and falling. Rain cell core just swept through the valley. Winds variable, gusting. Recommend holding or diverting to alternate. Willow Creek is too soft with current precipitation, but if you need a field off the books, you're the only traffic in the area." The call made the hairs on Aaron's arm twitch. Willow Creek was rough. The last thing he wanted was to try a forced landing on deteriorating dirt with limited crew and passengers. "System 2's acting up," Mei Lin said, eyes flicking between gauges. "If we lose hydraulics in this chop, the flaps and gear control will be compromised." Her voice kept the professional edge, but the underlying calculation was clear. Continuing into Larkspur meant threading a needle through a vascular storm with a potentially failing control system. "Divert," she implied without saying it. "Hold that thought," Aaron responded. He dipped the nose slightly to ride a gust, and banked the jet's heading a few degrees off toward the ridge, seeking a lull. That's when the unexpected happened. In the near white noise of rain beating on the windshield, a flicker of movement caught Aaron's peripheral vision. Small, rapid flashes just below the cloud ceiling, dancing in the downdraft zone above the tree line. At first, he thought it was the errant reflection of lightning, but the pattern was too controlled, too purposeful. A tiny blur, dipping and rising, moving with jittery urgency, traversed the gap ahead of them, and then shot along the edge of a darker patch of the terrain, an opening in the tree canopy where the rain seemed to thin slightly. "Do you see that?" Malin asked, following his gaze. The storm's roar was all-consuming, yet the little bird, no bigger than her thumbnail, kept flitting ahead of their path, weaving low and then surging toward a bare strip between clumps of oak. Its flight was erratic, frantic, and it seemed to be operating under some internal imperative, flying counter to the violent downdrafts that yanked at the aircraft. It passed under the plane's belly, hovered briefly, then darted forward again, its tiny wings a blur of determined agitation. "It's a hummingbird," Aaron muttered, half incredulous, then leaned forward. The bird's path traced a shallow valley that the storm had shaded, and at its end the forest dropped away. There was a clearing where the rain thinned to a mist, and, beyond it, a faint linear shape appeared, pale under the overcast. The old Willow Creek strip. The hummingbird hovered above its edge, and then zipped along it in a chaotic, almost territorial way, slapping the air with its darting tail before diving and slicing back up. Its pattern seemed to say, "Here. Safe. Here." Aaron's bush pilot instincts, years of reading bird activity and remote flying, sparked. Birds often know microclimates. They feel thermal buffers, eddies that human instruments only average out. A hummingbird in this weather, deliberately cutting through the worst of the downdrafts and congregating over a narrow strip of ground, was not normal. "May, that bird's trying to get our attention," he said. "It's flying like a beacon. Look where it's heading. Down there. That clearing. Could that be Willow Creek?" Malin squinted, adjusted the polarizing overlay on the HUD, and confirmed. The pale line beneath the rain was indeed a runway, a texture difference in the canopy that matched the location of the old strip. "It's the only break in the heavy cloud down there," she replied. "If that bird's beating the air over it, maybe the downdrafts are sheltering it. Could be a lee edge. Might give us a pocket of relative stability. If the hydraulics give out, we need a field we can see and get to fast." Aaron tuned their descent. "Willow Creek is unofficial, but I'd rather gamble on a compact strip with a known location than fight into Larkspur with unstable systems. Notify Tower. We're diverting to an emergency landing at Willow Creek. We're following the Hummingbird." He almost laughed at the absurdity of that last line, but he didn't say it over the radio. Malin transmitted his new intention to ATC with the necessary emergency squawk. The irregular behavior of a vital system qualified as a priority. The little bird remained ahead of them, leading, not in any mystical sense, but as a moving indicator of the calmer pocket around the strip. As Flight 317 lost altitude, the storm's core pressed in. Gusts attempted to toss the turboprop sideways, but Aaron used slight power adjustments to keep the craft within the narrow channel that the Hummingbird traced. The rain, heavy in places, thinned incrementally over the clearing, a phenomenon Aaron attributed to the interplay of downdrafts and the basin's microtopography. The Hummingbird darted over the length of the runway, then zipped toward the southern end, hovering over a cluster of wind-bent shrubs before breaking upward, as if to signal, "Start here." The strip was not long, about 2,200 feet of packed dirt, bordered by low embankments and flanked by scrub. It had survived the last season's brush, but had shown faint signs of compaction from previous emergency use. Visibility was marginal. The storm's underbelly made the horizon a smear of gray, and the wind had variable shear across the basin. Aaron briefed the passengers through the intercom with calm urgency. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Hale," he said, voice steady, though the turbulence rattled the cabin. "We're diverting to an emergency field at Willow Creek. We've had a system anomaly. Please remain seated, keep your seatbelts fastened, and follow crew instructions. Expect a rough landing. We have a guide, an unusual one, leading us in." Below, the Hummingbird's frantic flight continued, dipping briefly to the southern threshold, then flaring higher in a short, tight circle, where an old windsock, tattered and limp, hung sideways from a leaning post. The bird's agitation seemed to intensify when the aircraft wavered slightly, and it responded by shifting its flight path, cutting the edge of the gust like a small, living wind vane, then pausing to hover low over the runway's midpoint before zipping toward the approach path again. Aaron set the gear down. The hydraulics wavered, the pumps humming with slight irregularity, but the wheels extended. The runway loomed. He angled the plane into a stabilized 3-degree descent, banking slightly to counter a lateral gust. Using what little visual reference he had from the faint patch of lighter rain over the strip and the darting movement of the Hummingbird ahead as an unorthodox aiming point. The little bird finally landed on a crooked post at the start of the strip, perched, panting with vapor from its tiny respiration in the wet air. It bobbed once, then lifted as if saying, "Go." The first touch was firm. Aaron held the nose slightly up, letting the main gear kiss the dirt. The compacted soil behaved better than expected. The previous user's emergency grading had helped, and the shallow ditches on either side channeled surface water away enough to prevent the immediate aquaplaning that could have occurred. The plane's speed bled off as the pilots applied reverse thrust and careful braking. A sudden shear gust swept across midstrip, threatening to push the tail. But Maylin compensated with rudder input. The hydraulic flicker became more pronounced. The control field began to stiffen, and the left aileron responded with a slight delay, the kind that sent a ripple of tension through the cockpit. They had minutes, not seconds. The strip was shorter than ideal. Aaron eased the throttles back, letting the plane settle. The tail lifted, the nose dipped slightly as the plane's weight shifted, and the dirt runway crunched and spattered under the heavy tires. The patch of bare ground at the end approached fast. The Hummingbird, now a tiny silhouette on a leaning post, fluttered, wings buzzing like a tremor, and watched as the aircraft's nose gear kissed the end of the strip just before the embankment. The plane rolled, sputtered once with a soft bump as the tail slowed, then came to a full stop with dust and rain spraying around the wingtips. The cabin shook. The emergency alarms chimed their automatic sequence as systems sensed the abnormal deceleration. Aaron cut the engines. Silence followed, broken by the low murmur of breathing from stressed passengers and the soft, mechanical sigh of systems cycling down. "We're down," Maylin said, a tight smile forming despite herself. "We owe a small bird a big thanks." The Hummingbird, after a moment's pause, launched from its post and flitted directly over the nose of the plane, doing 2 quick, jittery loops before disappearing into the cloud shroud that hugged the canopy edge. The crew and passengers would later argue about whether it was a salute. In the moment, it was simply a living, frantic blur that had guided them into a sliver of safety. The passengers were evacuated quickly but carefully. Aaron and Maylin performed a systems check as the rain continued to lash the strip. The hydraulic system, while limping, was stable enough to power the minimal controls for taxiing if needed. The storm had made any further movement unwise. The small field had an emergency shelter, a metal Quonset hut used by the county's wildfire lookouts, stocked with basic supplies and a crank radio. The crew established contact with Larkspur Tower, relaying that Flight 317 had landed safely at Willow Creek and requesting ground team pickup. Within 40 minutes, an all-terrain rescue rig rattled up the strip, driven by local Forest Service pilots who had tracked the emergency beacon the aircraft had broadcast after landing. They brought blankets, hot drinks, and a weathered pilot named Jaime Ortiz, who had flown medevac missions out of the region for years. "Heard you had a little guide up there," Jaime said as she clambered out, glancing toward the patch of trees where the Hummingbird had disappeared. "Birds know these pockets. That bird did you a favor. We'll get the crew and passengers shuttled to the main lodge. Weather's going to lock it down for hours." Aaron and Maylin helped the passengers to the shelter, marshaling the anxious folks through the damp and into the dry warmth. Outside, the storm hammered the basin. Lightning forked in slow, distant strokes. Inside, the radio crackled with updates. Larkspur arranging a cross-country bus to retrieve the grounded passengers once conditions allowed. the airline dispatch coordinating a ferry flight, the maintenance crew mobilizing a recovery plan for the plane, and the structural team noting that the temporary strip had held under pressure. In a quiet moment, Aaron stepped outside, rain-coated, and walked to the edge of the clearing. The wind had shifted, the storm cell's core had passed over, and was now beginning its downstream decay. The hummingbird appeared, small and slick with rain, perched on a low branch, its iridescent throat dimmed by moisture. It watched him, tilting its head. Aaron held up a finger in a half-joking salute. The bird did a tiny flick of its wings and zipped away into the gray. He didn't say it aloud, but he thought, "Thank you." By the next morning, the storm had receded into broken shreds of cloud. The airline's incident response team arrived, bringing a formal inspector, a psychologist to speak with crew if needed, and a press liaison. The passengers had been fed, rebooked, and wrapped in dry layers. Larkspur's tower had recorded the diversion. The flight's manifest was updated to reflect an unscheduled emergency landing. Aaron and Maylene sat across from the airline investigator, recounting the sequence: weather escalation, hydraulic anomalies, the hummingbird's behavior, the decision to divert, the emergency approach, and the safe landing. "You followed a hummingbird to a dirt strip in a storm," the investigator said, sounding part skeptical, part impressed. "And that saved you." Aaron didn't frame it as mystic. "It wasn't leading us like a pilot," he clarified. "It was giving us a signal about where the turbulence was breaking. Small birds are sensitive to microclimate shear. That bird was cutting through the worst of the downdrafts and staying over that clearing. It made us look where we hadn't planned to. The field being sheltered wasn't coincidence. It was a pattern we would have missed without something twitching in front of our eyes." The technical debrief confirmed the hydraulic system had suffered a pressure spike during the descent, likely from stress-induced cavitation in the pump exacerbated by the gusty turbulence. If they'd attempted a go-around into Larkspur's congested, sheared airspace, losing full hydraulic control could have led to a landing with compromised flaps, potentially overrunning the runway or worse. The unofficial alternate, Willow Creek, had provided a controllable environment where pilots could manually compensate more effectively. The investigators' report, after several drafts, included a marginal note: biological indicator, small bird behavior, served as early microclimate cue, influencing emergency decision-making. Recommend further study. The Airline Safety Board, while affirming pilot skill and procedural adherence, added a recommendation for including anecdotal environmental inputs, especially from indigenous local knowledge and observed animal behavior, as supplementary data during emergency assessments. Some of the more conservative members raised a brow. The narrative of following a hummingbird was unorthodox in the cold language of checklists. The months that followed turned the incident into a quiet legend among pilots flying the corridor. At the next regional safety seminar, Aaron and Mei Lin presented the case study, not sensationalizing the hummingbird, but highlighting the layered situational awareness that had saved their aircraft and passengers. "We had a system degrading in a storm, multiple formal alternates compromised, and a bird showing a pocket of relative calm," Aaron said. "We paired instrument data with an unusual biological input, made a decision, and bought ourselves a landing opportunity. That's the margin that matters." The hummingbird, whose precise species the local biologists later identified as a migratory, ruby-throated cousin that had taken a wrong route during the storm season, continued to frequent the basin. Rangers and researchers started noting small, atypical behavior reports: birds lingering unusually over clearings, swifts avoiding gust cores, and in one case, a group of swallows leading hikers out of a sudden fog bank. Willow Creek's maintenance crew received modest funding for emergency-grade grading after the airline put in a guarded request. The field was fitted with better drainage, a weather station, and a rudimentary beacon to aid any future emergency glides. A small plaque was affixed near the base of the Quonset hut months later, carved by the local bush pilot community. "In memory of the little guide, who reminded us that survival is often a collaboration. 200 miles per hour, 2 engines, and a single fluttering heartbeat." Pilots passing through would sometimes pause, looking out at the clearing, half expecting to see a flicker of wings. Aaron kept a loose photograph of the hummingbird on his flight bag, a tiny smear of color captured during the emergency transfer. Nothing high-res, just enough to remind him. Mei Lin, when she did her recurrent training, quietly included a slide on non-traditional cues. Watching a bird's flight path in storm conditions could offer unexpected intelligence. Years later, a new generation of bush pilots and regional aviators would teach a version of the story to trainees, not as a superstition, but as a lesson in attentiveness. They say the sky gives you data, they'd say, and so does the ground. Sometimes even the smallest wings show you the way.